The sword trembled in King Cassian Ashworth's hand as the war horn sounded across the courtyard of Crimson Moon Castle. Every wolf in the kingdom knew that sound. It meant only one thing. A rogue had been caught, and blood would be spilled before sunset. Cassian did not flinch. He never did. As the Alpha King of the largest wolf kingdom in the northern lands, he had carried out more executions than he cared to count. Each time, he told himself the same thing. The law exists to protect the pack. A rogue who abandons their bond breaks the chain that holds every wolf together. Mercy for one means danger for thousands. He walked down the stone steps of his castle with his second in command, a broad-shouldered wolf named Gareth Holt, following close behind. Gareth had served the crown for over a decade, and in that time, he had never once seen the king hesitate. "They caught her near Thornwood Pass," Gareth said, his voice low, so the gathering crowd would not hear. Half-starved. Barely put up a fight. "A woman?" Cassian asked, his eyebrows rising slightly. Rogue wolves were almost always men. Women rarely survived long enough outside a pack's protection to be labeled rogue. The wilderness was unforgiving, and most died within days of losing their bond. "Yes, my king, Elena Voss, formerly of the Ashgrove pack." Cassian said nothing more. Names did not matter to him, only the law mattered. A rogue was a rogue, whether they wore silk or rags, whether they smiled or wept. The moment a wolf broke from their pack without permission from the Elder Council, they became a threat to the balance every kingdom depended on. The courtyard was already filling with people. Word had spread fast through the capital city of Vermont. Nobles stood on the balconies above, their fine cloaks catching the wind. Merchants and common folk pressed close to the wooden barriers, craning their necks for a glimpse of the prisoner. Executions were rare enough that they drew crowds like a festival, though the mood was far from festive. At the center of the courtyard stood a raised stone platform, worn smooth by centuries of use. It had seen the deaths of traitors, murderers, and rogues long before Cassian was born. His own father had stood on that same platform once, delivering judgment with the same cold resolve that Cassian now carried in his chest. The Elder Council had arrived ahead of him, seated in their high-backed chairs along the edge of the platform. Their leader, an aging wolf named Councilman Aldrich Thorne, rose to greet the king with a stiff bow. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, "the prisoner has been prepared. We ask only that justice be swift." "It will be," Cassian replied. He turned his gaze toward the iron gate at the far end of the courtyard, where two guards were already leading the prisoner forward. Cassian expected to see fear. He expected to see a broken creature, begging for a mercy that would never come. Instead, what he saw made something inside his chest tighten in a way he could not explain. The woman being led toward the platform did not stumble. She did not weep. Her wrists were bound in heavy iron chains, her clothes torn and stained from days spent hiding in the forest. Yet she walked with her chin lifted, her eyes scanning the crowd without a trace of shame. Her hair, the color of autumn leaves, fell loose around her shoulders, tangled from the wilderness but still somehow striking in the afternoon light. Cassian frowned. Rogues were supposed to be desperate, broken. This woman looked like she had survived something far worse than exile, and had come out the other side sharpened rather than shattered. "Bring her closer," Aldrich ordered the guards. The chains rattled as Elena Voss was forced to kneel at the edge of the platform, just a few feet from where Cassian stood. Even now, even facing death, she did not lower her eyes. She looked directly at the king, and something flickered across her face that Cassian could not name. Not fear, not hatred, something closer to weary defiance, as though she had already made peace with whatever came next, and refused to let anyone see her break. "Elena Voss," Aldrich announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You stand accused of abandoning your pack without consent from the Elder Council, a crime punishable by execution under the laws of the Crimson Moon Kingdom. Do you deny this charge?" Elena's jaw tightened. For a moment, Cassian thought she might speak, might offer some explanation or plea, but she said nothing. She simply lowered her gaze to the stone beneath her knees, as though she had learned long ago that words changed nothing. "Her silence confirms her guilt," Aldrich said, turning toward Cassian. "Your Majesty, the sentence must be carried out by your hand, as is tradition for crimes against the crown itself." Cassian had performed this duty many times before. He unsheathed his sword, the polished blade catching the light of the afternoon sun. The crowd fell silent, the only sound the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere above the castle towers. He stepped forward, positioning himself in front of the kneeling woman. This was the part of the ritual he had trained his mind to endure. Look at the crime, not the person. Remember the pack, not the individual. Justice required distance, and distance required forgetting that the person kneeling before him had once laughed, had once loved, had once been more than the charge written against their name. But as he raised the sword above his head, Elena lifted her eyes to meet his. The moment their gazes locked, something shifted inside Cassian that he had never felt before. It was as though the ground beneath him tilted, as though every sound in the courtyard faded into a distant hum. His wolf, the primal instinct buried deep within every shifter, surged forward, with a force that nearly buckled his knees. A single word echoed through his mind, with a certainty he could not deny. Mate. Cassian had heard stories of the mate bond his entire life. Every wolf did. It was said that when true mates locked eyes for the first time, an invisible thread connected their souls, a pull so powerful that resisting it was said to be nearly impossible. Cassian had always assumed such stories were exaggerated, the kind of tale parents told children to make courtship seem more magical than it truly was. He had never expected to feel it himself, and certainly never expected to feel it while standing over a condemned prisoner with a sword raised above his head. His arm trembled. The sword, which had felt weightless a moment before, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. His wolf howled inside him, a sound of pure anguish, refusing to let his body complete the motion his mind had been trained to perform 1,000 times before. Elena's eyes widened slightly, as though she too had felt something shift in the air between them, though confusion rather than recognition crossed her face. She did not know what a mate bond felt like from this side of fate, having never expected to find hers in the final moments of her life. Cassian's grip loosened. The sword slipped from his fingers and struck the stone platform with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire courtyard. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the elder council, wolves who had witnessed centuries of tradition and ceremony, stared in stunned silence. An alpha king did not drop his sword, not during a hunt, not during battle, and certainly not during an execution ordered by the highest authority in the land. Your Majesty? Aldrich's voice cut through the silence, sharp with concern and something close to suspicion. Is something wrong? Cassian stood frozen, staring down at Elena, who now looked equally bewildered, her chained hands curling slightly against the stone beneath her, as though bracing for an explanation that made sense of what had just happened. The crowd murmured louder, whispers spreading through the gathered nobles and common folk alike. Some spoke of omens, others whispered that their king had lost his nerve, that the pressure of the crown had finally broken something within him. Cassian barely heard any of it. His entire focus remained locked on the woman kneeling before him, the woman he had been ordered to kill, the woman his wolf now refused to see harmed in any way. He bent down slowly and retrieved his sword from the stone, sheathing it with deliberate care, as his mind raced to find words that would explain what had just happened, without revealing the truth that now consumed his every thought. The execution will be postponed, Cassian said finally, his voice steady, despite the storm raging inside him. The courtyard erupted into murmurs and confusion. Aldrich rose from his seat, his weathered face creased with disbelief. Postponed? Your Majesty, the law is clear. There is no provision for delay once judgment has been passed. I am the law, Cassian said, his voice carrying a warning that silenced the councilman instantly, and I require further interrogation of the prisoner before her sentence is carried out. If there are details of her crime that remain unclear, it is my duty to uncover them before executing judgment. It was a thin excuse, and Cassian knew it. Every wolf in that courtyard likely suspected there was more to the story than his words suggested, but no one, not even the elder council, dared question the king directly in front of a crowd of witnesses. Aldrich's eyes narrowed, but he inclined his head in reluctant acceptance. As you wish, Your Majesty. The prisoner will be held in the castle dungeons until you are ready to proceed. Cassian gave a single nod, then turned to Gareth. Take her to a private cell. Ensure she is treated properly. No harm is to come to her. Gareth's brow furrowed with obvious confusion, but he had served long enough to recognize when questioning his king would serve no purpose. Yes, my king. As the guards moved to lift Elena from her knees, she glanced back toward Cassian one final time, before being led away. Her expression had shifted from confusion, to something sharper, more calculating, as though she was beginning to understand that whatever had just happened between them might be the only thing standing between her and death. Cassian remained on the platform long after the courtyard had begun to empty, his mind replaying the moment their eyes had met, the undeniable pull that had stripped him of his resolve in front of his entire kingdom. He had sworn an oath to protect the laws of his people above all else. Yet in a single heartbeat, everything he believed about duty and justice had been thrown into question. For the first time in his life as king, Cassian Ashworth did not know what to do next. The dungeon beneath Crimson Moon Castle smelled of damp stone and old iron. Elena Voss sat against the cold wall of her cell, her wrists still raw from the chains, though the guards had at least removed them once she was locked behind bars. She stared at the small barred window near the ceiling, watching the last light of the afternoon fade into evening. She should have been dead by now. Elena replayed the moment on the platform over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. The king's sword had been raised. She had accepted it. After weeks of running, hiding, and surviving on nothing but stolen scraps and sheer will, she had finally allowed herself to believe that death might be a kind of relief. And then, in the space of a single breath, everything had changed. She remembered the way his eyes had locked onto hers. She remembered the strange pull in her chest, a sensation she had never experienced before, one that made her heart pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She had heard whispers of the mate bond from other wolves in her old pack, hushed conversations among mated couples who spoke of an instant recognition that could not be denied. She had always assumed it was nothing more than a comforting myth, a story told to young wolves to give them hope during courtship. She certainly never expected to feel it while kneeling before an executioner's blade. Footsteps echoed down the stone corridor. Elena straightened instinctively, years of survival instinct overriding her exhaustion. A guard she recognized as Gareth Holt appeared at the cell door, a tray of food and water in his hands. "The king ordered you to be fed," Gareth said, sliding the tray through a gap in the bars. His tone was neutral, though his eyes studied her with obvious curiosity. Elena eyed the tray warily. Why would he bother feeding a prisoner he plans to execute? Gareth did not answer. He simply nodded once and turned to leave, his footsteps fading back down the corridor. Elena stared at the food for a long moment before hunger won out over suspicion. She had not eaten a proper meal in nearly 2 weeks. She ate slowly, methodically, her mind still turning over every possible explanation for what had happened in the courtyard. It was well past midnight when she heard footsteps again, heavier this time, accompanied by the faint metallic sound of a key turning in a lock. Elena rose to her feet as the cell door creaked open, and King Cassian Ashworth stepped inside alone, without guards, without his crown, dressed only in a simple dark tunic that made him look far less imposing than he had on the execution platform. "Come to finish what you started?" Elena asked, her voice steady, despite the tension coiling in her stomach. Cassian studied her for a long moment before responding. "If I wanted you dead, you would already be dead." "Then why am I still breathing?" He hesitated, and Elena noticed the way his jaw tightened, as though the words he needed to say were difficult to form. "Do you know what a mate bond feels like?" The question caught her completely off guard. Elena's mouth opened slightly, then closed again as she processed what he had asked. "I have heard stories," she said carefully. "Older wolves speak of it sometimes. An instant pull toward another person, a recognition that goes beyond ordinary attraction." "That is what I felt," Cassian said. "When I looked at you on that platform, I felt it the moment our eyes met." Elena stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was some cruel trick, some new form of interrogation, designed to break her resolve before her execution finally proceeded. But there was no mockery in his expression, only a kind of stunned uncertainty that mirrored the confusion still churning inside her own chest. "That is impossible," she said finally. "Fate does not choose a rogue wolf as a match for a king. It would be a cruel joke, even for the universe." "I do not believe it is a joke," Cassian said quietly, "but I understand your doubt." Elena crossed her arms, though the chains that had bound her only hours earlier had left her wrists too sore for the gesture to feel natural. "Even if what you say is true, it changes nothing. I am still a rogue in the eyes of your law. Fate cannot undo the charges against me." "Tell me your story," Cassian said. "From the beginning. I want to understand why you left your pack." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing whether honesty would serve her better than silence. She had learned, over the past several weeks, that silence rarely protected her from anything. Perhaps the truth, spoken plainly, might accomplish more than she expected. "I was born into the Ashgrove Pack," she began. "My parents served the Alpha faithfully for years. When they died in an illness that swept through our territory, I was raised under the protection of Alpha Callum Ashgrove himself, or so everyone believed." Cassian remained silent, listening intently as she continued. "Callum was not the leader people believed him to be," Elena said, her voice growing harder. "Behind closed doors, he ruled through fear rather than respect. Those who questioned him disappeared, or were labeled traitors. I served as one of his personal guards for years, loyal, despite everything I witnessed, because I believed loyalty was the only path to survival." "What changed?" Cassian asked. Elena's fingers curled slightly at her sides. "3 months ago, I discovered that Callum had been stealing resources meant for the Pack's most vulnerable families, hoarding grain and medicine, while claiming shortages to the Elder Council. When I confronted him privately, he did not deny it. Instead, he threatened to have me killed if I ever spoke a word of what I had seen. And you fled." "I had no choice," Elena said. 2 nights later, Callum accused me publicly of theft, claiming I had stolen from the Pack's treasury to fund my own escape. He turned the entire Pack against me before I could even defend myself. I ran because staying meant certain death, whether by his hand or by the mob he had already convinced of my guilt. Cassian's expression darkened. "You are saying the charge of theft, the crime that labeled you rogue, was fabricated?" "I have no way to prove it," Elena admitted. "It is my word against an Alpha's, and Alphas are rarely questioned by their own council." For a long moment, Cassian said nothing, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as though turning her words over carefully in his mind. Elena watched him, uncertain whether she had just handed him a weapon to use against her, or a reason to finally believe her. "If what you say is true," Cassian said slowly, "then the law that condemned you was built on a lie." "Kings rarely investigate the claims of rogues," Elena said bitterly, "especially rogues who cannot offer proof." "I am not most kings," Cassian said, and something in his tone made Elena believe, for the first time since her capture, that perhaps he meant it. He turned toward the cell door, pausing before he left. "I will look into your claims myself. Until then, you will remain here, but you will be treated as a guest of this castle, not a condemned prisoner." "Why would you do this?" Elena asked, her voice quieter now, stripped of the defiance she had carried since her capture. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Cassian turned back to face her, and for a brief moment, something softer flickered across his expression, something that looked almost like regret. "Because my wolf recognized yours the moment our eyes met, and I nearly killed you before I understood what that meant. I owe you the truth, at the very least." He left without another word, the heavy cell door closing behind him with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty corridor. Elena remained standing for a long time after his footsteps faded, her mind racing with questions she had no answers for. She had spent weeks running from a false accusation, certain that no one in power would ever believe her story. Now, the very king who had nearly executed her seemed prepared to risk his own authority to uncover the truth behind her exile. Elena did not know whether to trust this sudden change in her fortune, or whether it was simply another trap designed by powerful men who had never once considered her survival worth protecting. But as she settled back against the cold stone wall of her cell, she found herself hoping, for the first time in a long while, that perhaps her luck had finally begun to change. Outside, in the corridor above the dungeon, Cassian stood alone for several long minutes before returning to his chambers. Something about Elena's story had struck a chord within him that went beyond the mate bond pulling at his instincts. He had ruled his kingdom for nearly 6 years, and in that time, he had rarely questioned the reports brought before him by trusted alphas and councilmen. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered how many other so-called rogues might have been telling the truth all along, silenced by a system that never bothered to listen. He intended to find out, no matter what it cost him. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of the castle library, as Cassian paced back and forth across the polished floor, his mind still consumed by the events of the previous night. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elena Voss kneeling on that platform, her gaze steady, even in the face of death. Gareth entered the room quietly, closing the heavy door behind him. You wanted to see me, my king. I need you to gather everything you can find on Alpha Callum Ashgrove, Cassian said without turning around. Trade records, council reports, correspondence with the Elder Council over the past year. Everything. Gareth's brow furrowed. May I ask why, my king? Cassian finally turned to face him. The prisoner claims Callum falsified charges against her to hide his own theft from the Pack's resources. I intend to find out if she is telling the truth. With respect, my king, Gareth said carefully, rogues often claim innocence. It would not be the first time a prisoner tried to manipulate their way out of judgment. I am aware of that, Cassian said, his voice sharper than he intended. He softened it slightly before continuing, which is exactly why I need proof, one way or another. If she is lying, the execution will proceed as planned. If she is telling the truth, then an innocent wolf nearly died by my own hand, because no one thought to question an alpha's word. Gareth studied him for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more behind the king's sudden interest than simple justice. He had served Cassian long enough to recognize the signs of a man whose resolve had been shaken, though he chose not to press further. I will have the records gathered by evening, Gareth said finally. As Gareth left to carry out his orders, Cassian remained in the library, staring out the window at the courtyard below, the very place where he had nearly ended Elena's life the day before. The stone platform stood empty now, but he could still picture every detail of that moment with painful clarity. He thought of his father, the previous king, who had ruled with an iron sense of justice that left little room for doubt or hesitation. Cassian had been trained since childhood to make decisions quickly and decisively, to trust the reports brought before him, without questioning the motives of those who delivered them. It had never occurred to him, until now, how easily that trust could be exploited by those seeking to protect their own secrets. By late afternoon, Gareth returned with a stack of documents, setting them carefully on the long table in the center of the library. Trade records from Ashgrove territory over the past 2 years, along with correspondence submitted to the Elder Council regarding resource distribution. Cassian began sorting through the papers immediately, his eyes scanning line after line of numbers and reports. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary: grain shipments, medicine allocations, tax records. But as he compared the figures more closely, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Look at this, Cassian said, sliding a document across the table toward Gareth. The grain reported as delivered to Ashgrove territory last winter is nearly 30% higher than what was actually distributed to the Pack's families, according to these secondary records from the regional healer. Gareth leaned over the document, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. That is a significant discrepancy. There is more, Cassian continued, pulling out another set of papers. Medicine shipments meant for the sick and elderly during the illness outbreak 2 winters ago show similar gaps. Nearly a quarter of the recorded supplies cannot be accounted for in the healer's actual distribution logs. Perhaps clerical errors, Gareth suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Clerical errors do not typically favor the same pattern month after month, Cassian said. Someone was skimming resources meant for vulnerable families and reporting false numbers to cover the theft. The 2 men worked late into the evening, cross-referencing records and correspondence, building a clearer picture of the corruption that had apparently been running through Ashgrove territory for years. The evidence, while not conclusive on its own, painted a troubling picture that aligned closely with the story Elena had told the previous night. There is one more thing, Gareth said, pulling a folded letter from the bottom of the stack. This was submitted to the Elder Council 3 months ago, around the same time the prisoner claims she discovered the theft. Cassian took the letter and unfolded it carefully. It was a formal complaint, filed by Alpha Callum Ashgrove himself, accusing a member of his personal guard of stealing funds from the Pack treasury. The guard's name was listed clearly at the bottom of the document. Elena Voss. This is the accusation that condemned her, Cassian said quietly. It appears legitimate on paper, Gareth noted. Signed, sealed, submitted through proper channels. Which is exactly the problem, Cassian said, setting the letter down. An alpha's word is rarely questioned by the council, especially when it comes wrapped in official documentation. If Callum orchestrated this accusation to silence Elena before she could expose his theft, he would have known exactly how to make it appear credible. Gareth was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of what they had uncovered. If this is true, my king, it means the Elder Council condemned an innocent wolf based on falsified evidence, and you very nearly carried out that sentence yourself. Cassian felt the weight of that truth settle heavily in his chest. He thought of the sword slipping from his fingers on the platform, the moment his wolf had refused to let him complete the execution. Had that instinct been wrong, he would have killed a woman whose only crime was discovering the truth about her own alpha's corruption. I need more than circumstantial evidence before I bring this before the Elder Council, Cassian said. Callum will not admit to theft simply because we suspect him. I need proof strong enough that even the council cannot dismiss it. How do you propose we get that? Gareth asked. Cassian's expression hardened with resolve. We speak with witnesses, members of the Ashgrove Pack, who may have seen something, who may be willing to speak the truth if given proper protection. And we speak with the regional healer directly, to confirm the discrepancies in the medicine records. That will take time, my king, possibly weeks. Then we will take the time necessary, Cassian said. I will not execute an innocent wolf simply because uncovering the truth proves inconvenient. Gareth studied his king for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that suggested he finally understood the deeper reason behind Cassian's sudden determination. This is about more than justice, isn't it, my king? Cassian did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting toward the window once more. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over the castle grounds, casting long shadows across the courtyard, where Elena had nearly lost her life the day before. It is about justice, Cassian said finally. But you are right, that it is also about something more. I felt something when I looked at her, Gareth, something I have never felt before in my life. I do not fully understand it yet, but I know I cannot ignore it. Gareth nodded slowly, choosing not to press the matter further. Then I will help you find the proof you need, my king. Whatever it takes. Thank you, Cassian said quietly. As Gareth gathered the documents to begin preparing their next steps, Cassian remained by the window, his thoughts drifting back to the cell beneath the castle, where Elena Voss waited, uncertain of her fate. He thought of the weary defiance in her eyes when she had knelt before him on that platform, the quiet strength she had carried, even in the face of certain death. Whatever came next, Cassian knew he could no longer see her simply as a prisoner awaiting judgment. She had become something far more complicated, a woman whose survival now felt as important to him as the laws he had sworn to protect. He only hoped that uncovering the truth would come quickly enough to keep her safe from those who still wished to see her silenced for good. Word of the postponed execution spread through Vermont faster than Cassian anticipated. By the third day, rumors had twisted into a dozen different versions of the story, each one wilder than the last. Some claimed the king had lost his nerve. Others whispered that dark magic had bewitched him on the platform. A few, closer to the truth than they realized, murmured about fate and mate bonds, though none dared speak the theory openly in the presence of the Elder Council. Councilman Aldrich Thorne requested an audience with the king on the morning of the fourth day, and Cassian knew from the tone of the message that the meeting would not be pleasant. Aldrich arrived in the throne room, accompanied by 2 other council members, their expressions grim as they approached the raised dais where Cassian sat. He rose to greet them, though he remained standing, rather than returning to his throne, a small gesture meant to convey that this conversation would be handled as equals rather than subjects addressing their ruler. Your Majesty, Aldrich began, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of a man who had served 3 different kings in his lifetime. It has been 4 days since the execution was postponed. The council grows concerned about the message this delay sends to the kingdom. What message would that be? Cassian asked evenly. That the law bends based on the whims of the crown, Aldrich said. That justice is no longer swift or certain. Already we hear whispers among the border packs, wolves questioning whether the crown's authority has weakened. Cassian folded his arms behind his back, a posture he had learned from his father that projected calm authority, even in moments of internal turmoil. I was under the impression that justice required certainty before punishment, not merely speed. The prisoner's guilt was already established, through proper council proceedings, said the second councilman, a sharp-featured wolf named Councilman Percival Vane. Her own silence during sentencing confirmed her acceptance of the charges. Silence is not confirmation, Cassian said. It may simply mean a prisoner has learned that speaking rarely changes the outcome of a trial, already decided, before she ever entered the courtroom. The 3 councilmen exchanged uneasy glances. Aldrich cleared his throat before continuing. Your Majesty, might I ask what has prompted this sudden concern for procedural fairness? In 6 years as king, you have never once questioned a council ruling. Cassian considered his words carefully before responding. He had not yet decided how much to reveal about the mate bond, uncertain how the council would react to such a personal revelation, influencing matters of state. For now, he chose to frame his concerns purely in terms of justice. I have reason to believe the charges against Elena Voss may have been fabricated by her former alpha to conceal his own corruption, Cassian said. I am currently gathering evidence to confirm or dismiss these suspicions. Until that investigation concludes, I will not carry out an execution that may prove to be a grave miscarriage of justice. Percival's expression hardened with obvious skepticism. And this evidence, Your Majesty, how solid is it? Solid enough that I am unwilling to ignore it, Cassian said firmly. I have uncovered financial discrepancies in Ashgrove territory that align closely with the prisoner's account of her alpha stealing resources meant for vulnerable families. I intend to pursue this matter further before any sentence is carried out. Aldrich studied the king for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to press the issue further or accept the delay for now. How long do you require, Your Majesty? 2 weeks, Cassian said. If my investigation uncovers nothing further, the execution will proceed as originally ordered. The council members exchanged another round of glances before Aldrich finally nodded, though his expression remained tight with reluctance. 2 weeks, Your Majesty, but I must caution you that further delays will require formal justification before the full council, not simply your word alone. Understood, Cassian said. As the councilman departed the throne room, Cassian felt a weight settle in his chest, aware that he had just placed himself on a collision course with the very institution he had sworn to uphold. 2 weeks was a generous window compared to what the council typically allowed, but it left little room for error in uncovering proof solid enough to overturn an official ruling. That evening, Cassian descended once more to the dungeon, finding Elena seated near the small window of her cell, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. She turned as he approached, her expression guarded but no longer hostile, a shift he had noticed slowly developing over the past several days. The council is growing impatient, Cassian said, settling into the chair the guards had placed outside her cell for his visits. I have secured 2 weeks to gather proof of your innocence. Elena's fingers curled slightly at her sides, and if 2 weeks is not enough, then I will find a way to secure more time, Cassian said. I do not intend to let this end with your death, Elena, regardless of what the council believes about procedure and precedent. Something in his tone made Elena study him more closely, her earlier wariness softening slightly into curiosity. You barely know me, yet you are willing to challenge your own counsel for my sake. I do not understand why. Neither do I, fully, Cassian admitted. But I know that ignoring what I felt on that platform would be a lie, and I have never been comfortable with lies, even ones that might make my life considerably easier. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the small window once more. My former pack taught me that trusting those in power rarely ends well. Callum smiled at me for years before he tried to have me killed. Forgive me if I struggle to believe that a king would risk his own authority for a stranger's sake. I understand your hesitation, Cassian said. I would feel the same, in your position. But I intend to prove myself through actions rather than words. Gareth and I have already gathered evidence of financial discrepancies in your former territory. Tomorrow, we begin interviewing witnesses who may be willing to confirm your account. Elena's eyes widened slightly with surprise. Witnesses? Who would dare speak against Callum? Perhaps no one, at first, Cassian admitted. But if enough evidence accumulates, even fearful wolves may find the courage to speak the truth, especially if they believe the king himself is prepared to protect them from retaliation. Elena studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes that Cassian could not quite name. Why does this matter so much to you? Surely a king has more pressing concerns than the fate of a single rogue wolf. Cassian considered the question carefully before answering. Because I nearly killed an innocent woman, on nothing more than an alpha's word, in front of my entire kingdom. If Callum's corruption goes unpunished, it means the very system I am sworn to protect failed you completely, and it may fail others in the same way, if left unaddressed. And the mate bond has nothing to do with your determination? Elena asked, a hint of dry humor creeping into her voice for the first time since her capture. Despite the tension of the conversation, Cassian felt the corner of his mouth lift slightly. I would be lying if I claimed it played no role at all. But even without it, I believe uncovering the truth would matter to me. The bond has simply made me realize how easily I might have failed to notice injustice happening right beneath my own throne. Elena's expression softened further, though wariness still lingered in her eyes. I want to believe you, she said quietly. It has simply been difficult to trust anyone since I fled Ashgrove territory. I do not expect trust to come easily, Cassian said. I only ask that you allow me the chance to earn it, through actions, rather than promises. Elena nodded slowly, though she said nothing further. Cassian rose from his chair, preparing to depart for the evening, though he paused at the cell door before leaving. Whatever happens in the coming weeks, he said, know that I do not regret dropping that sword. Regardless of what the council believes, or what the kingdom whispers, I do not regret it. He left before she could respond, though as his footsteps faded down the corridor, Elena remained by the window for a long while, turning his words over in her mind. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to feel something close to hope, though she remained careful not to let it grow too large, too quickly. Hope, she had learned painfully well, could be just as dangerous as despair when placed in the wrong hands. Still, as she watched the stars scattered across the night sky, she found herself wondering, for the first time in weeks, whether perhaps her survival might mean something more than simply escaping death. Perhaps it might mean finally finding a place where the truth actually mattered. The road to Ashgrove territory stretched long and winding through dense forest, the kind of path Cassian rarely traveled without a full guard escort. This time, he brought only Gareth and 2 trusted soldiers, wanting to keep their investigation quiet until they had gathered enough evidence to act with certainty. They arrived at the outskirts of Ashgrove territory just after midday, disguising their identities with plain traveling cloaks, rather than announcing the presence of the king. Cassian had learned enough from his father's reign to know that people spoke more freely when they did not fear the consequences of an official inquiry looming over their words. Their first stop was the modest home of the regional healer, an elderly wolf named Nora Whitfield, who had served Ashgrove territory for nearly 30 years. She greeted them cautiously at her door, her sharp eyes studying the strangers with obvious suspicion, until Gareth quietly revealed the royal seal hidden beneath his cloak. "Your Majesty," Nora whispered, quickly ushering them inside and closing the door behind them. "Forgive me, I did not recognize you without your usual attire." "That was intentional," Cassian said. "We are here regarding a matter of some sensitivity, and I would prefer our visit remain discreet for now." Nora's expression shifted to careful attentiveness as she gestured for them to sit at her small wooden table. "How may I be of service, Your Majesty? I understand you oversaw medicine distribution during the illness outbreak 2 winters ago," Cassian said. "I need to know whether the supplies recorded as delivered actually reached the families who needed them." Nora's hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a long moment, she said nothing, clearly weighing the risks of speaking honestly against a powerful alpha who still ruled her territory. "Your Majesty, I must ask, is this inquiry connected to Elena Voss?" Cassian's expression remained steady, though he noted the flicker of concern in the healer's eyes at the mention of Elena's name. "It is. Do you know something about her situation?" Nora exhaled slowly, glancing toward her shuttered window, as though checking for unwanted listeners before continuing. "Elena came to me 3 months ago, distressed, and asking questions about supply records. She suspected something was wrong with the medicine allocations, and she was right. Nearly a quarter of what was recorded as distributed never reached the families on my list. I told her what I knew, though I begged her to be careful about confronting Callum directly." "And after she confronted him?" Cassian asked. "Within 2 days, Callum announced that Elena had been caught stealing from the pack treasury," Nora said, her voice tightening with obvious anger. "I knew it was a lie the moment I heard it. Elena had spent years protecting this pack loyally, but no one questioned an alpha's word, and I was too afraid to speak up against him myself. Would you be willing to testify to what you just told me, before the Elder Council?" Cassian asked. Nora hesitated, fear flickering plainly across her weathered face. "Your Majesty, if Callum discovers I spoke against him, my safety, and my family's safety would be at risk. I will ensure your protection, Cassian said firmly. You and your family will be granted sanctuary within Vermont if necessary. I do not intend to let anyone suffer for speaking the truth. Nora studied him for a long moment before finally nodding, her resolve visibly strengthening. Then I will testify, Your Majesty. Elena deserves justice, and I have carried this guilt long enough. Their next stop was a small farmhouse on the edge of Ashgrove territory, home to a former guard named Owen Blackwell, who Gareth had learned through discreet inquiries had served alongside Elena before her exile. Owen was initially reluctant to speak, clearly wary of the consequences that had befallen Elena for questioning Callum's authority. But after Cassian explained the evidence already gathered, and the healer's willingness to testify, Owen finally relented. Elena discovered the theft nearly a week before Callum accused her, Owen admitted, his voice low, as though the walls themselves might report his words back to his alpha. I saw her confront him privately in his study. I did not hear every word, but I heard enough to know she threatened to bring the matter before the Elder Council if he did not correct the theft himself. Did Callum threaten her in response? Cassian asked. He told her that no one would believe a guard's word over an alpha's, Owen said. 2 days later, the theft accusation against her was announced publicly. I always believed it was fabricated, but speaking against Callum meant risking everything I had built for my family. Would you testify to what you witnessed? Cassian asked. Owen hesitated only briefly before nodding. If it means correcting the wrong done to Elena, yes, Your Majesty. I will testify. By the time Cassian and his small group returned to Vermont 3 days later, they had gathered testimony from 4 separate witnesses within Ashgrove territory, each confirming pieces of Elena's account. Combined with the financial discrepancies already uncovered in the trade and medicine records, the evidence against Callum had grown substantial enough that even the Elder Council would struggle to dismiss it outright. Cassian descended to the dungeon immediately upon returning, eager to share the progress with Elena, who rose from her seat near the window the moment she heard his familiar footsteps approaching. You have news, she said, studying his expression carefully. We spoke with the healer, Nora Whitfield, and a former guard named Owen Blackwell, Cassian said. Both confirmed your account of discovering the theft and confronting Callum before your exile. Combined with the financial records already gathered, I believe we now have sufficient evidence to bring formal charges against him before the Elder Council. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she absorbed his words, years of carrying an unjust accusation finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. They agreed to testify, even knowing the risk to themselves? They did, Cassian said. I have promised them protection within Vermont if Callum attempts any retaliation. Elena sat down slowly on the edge of her small cot, her composure finally cracking after days of carefully maintained defiance. I had almost convinced myself that no one would ever believe me, that the truth simply did not matter against an alpha's word. It matters, Cassian said quietly, moving closer to the bars separating them. It has always mattered. It simply required someone willing to look past the accusation and search for the truth underneath it. Elena looked up at him, her eyes glistening with emotion she had clearly worked hard to suppress since her capture. Thank you, she said softly, for believing me when you had every reason not to. I could not ignore what my instincts told me, Cassian said. Not about the mate bond, and not about your innocence. Both truths arrive together, and I have come to trust that they are connected in ways I am only beginning to understand. For the first time since her arrival at Crimson Moon Castle, Elena allowed herself a small, genuine smile, fragile, but real. What happens now? Now, we bring the evidence before the Elder Council, Cassian said. Callum will be summoned to answer for his crimes, and your false conviction will be formally overturned. And if he denies everything? If he tries to turn the council against your evidence? Cassian's expression hardened with quiet determination. Then we will let the witnesses speak for themselves, and we will let the truth stand against whatever lies he attempts to construct in his defense. I have seen enough now to know that justice, real justice, requires more than accepting the word of those who hold power. It requires searching for the truth, even when doing so proves inconvenient. Elena studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that looked, for the first time, like genuine trust rather than cautious hope. I believe you, she said quietly. I did not expect to say that so soon, but I believe you. Cassian felt something warm settle in his chest at her words, a feeling entirely separate from the pull of the mate bond, though closely intertwined with it. He had spent days working to earn her trust, through actions rather than empty promises, and hearing her finally acknowledge that effort meant more to him than he had anticipated. "Rest well tonight," Cassian said, rising to leave. "Tomorrow, we begin preparing for the council hearing that will finally set things right." As he walked back through the castle corridors toward his own chambers, Cassian found himself reflecting on how much had changed in the span of a single week. He had begun this journey intending only to satisfy his own conscience, to ensure he had not executed an innocent woman based on false evidence. Somewhere along the way, that mission had transformed into something far more personal, a growing determination to protect Elena Voss, not simply because fate had marked her as his mate, but because she deserved justice, regardless of what the bond between them might eventually become. Whatever challenges awaited them before the Elder Council, Cassian intended to face them with the same resolve that had led him to drop his sword on that platform days earlier. He would not allow fear of political consequence to outweigh his commitment to the truth, not when so much now depended on getting this decision right. News of the king's return from Ashgrove territory reached the castle advisors before Cassian had even removed his traveling cloak. Among those most eager to learn the details was Councilman Percival Vane, who requested an urgent private meeting the following morning, claiming concerns about the growing rumors surrounding the postponed execution. Cassian agreed to the meeting, unaware that Percival's true motives ran far deeper than simple curiosity about council procedure. What Cassian did not know was that Percival had maintained a quiet alliance with Alpha Callum Ashgrove for nearly 3 years, an arrangement built on mutual benefit that neither man had ever disclosed to the Elder Council. In exchange for Percival's influence in smoothing over occasional disputes between Ashgrove territory and neighboring packs, Callum had provided the councilman with a steady stream of gold, siphoned quietly from the very resources meant for his own struggling pack members. When word reached Percival that Cassian's investigation had uncovered financial discrepancies and gathered witness testimony against Callum, he understood immediately that his own secret arrangement stood at serious risk of exposure. If Callum fell, there was no guarantee the corrupt Alpha would protect Percival's involvement, rather than exposing it to save himself from further punishment. Percival needed to ensure Elena Voss never lived long enough to testify against Callum in a formal hearing. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Percival made his way to the castle dungeons, using his council credentials to gain access without arousing suspicion among the guards stationed there. He carried with him a small vial of poison, concealed within a flask he claimed contained medicinal tea, meant to ease the prisoner's recovery from her earlier ordeal. "Councilman," the guard on duty said, straightening with surprise as Percival approached, "I was not informed of any scheduled visit tonight." "The king asked me to deliver this personally," Percival said smoothly, holding up the flask. "A tonic, to aid her recovery, given the upcoming hearing, requires her testimony to be clear and coherent." The guard hesitated only briefly before stepping aside, unwilling to question a member of the Elder Council directly. Percival made his way down the dim corridor toward Elena's cell, his expression carefully arranged into a mask of polite concern. Elena eyed him warily as he approached, her instincts immediately flagging something wrong about the situation. She had learned, over years of navigating Ashgrove's corrupt hierarchy, to trust the quiet unease that settled in her stomach whenever someone with power approached her carrying gifts she had not requested. "The king sent this for you," Percival said, extending the flask through the bars. "A tonic, to help you recover before the hearing." Elena did not immediately reach for the flask, studying Percival's expression carefully. Something about his tone felt rehearsed, and his eyes did not quite meet hers as he spoke. "I was unaware the king had discussed any tonics with the council," Elena said carefully. "He generally delivers such things himself." Percival's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "He was occupied this evening, and asked me to see to it in his stead." Before Elena could respond further, footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Gareth appeared at the far end, having come to check on the prisoner as part of his usual evening rounds. He paused at the sight of Percival standing before Elena's cell. "Councilman Vane," Gareth said, his tone polite but edged with obvious surprise. "I was not aware you intended to visit the prisoner tonight." "The king asked me to deliver a recovery tonic," Percival repeated, though his composure had grown noticeably tighter under Gareth's scrutiny. Gareth's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the flask still extended through the bars. Something about the situation felt wrong to him as well, though he could not immediately identify the source of his unease. I was with the king less than an hour ago, councilman. He made no mention of any tonic being prepared for the prisoner. Percival's expression flickered with barely concealed panic before he attempted to recover his composure. Perhaps he simply forgot to mention it amid his other duties. Regardless, the tonic will help ease her condition before the hearing. I would prefer to confirm this directly with the king before allowing the prisoner to consume anything, Gareth said, his tone hardening. Given the sensitivity surrounding this case, I am certain you understand the need for caution. Percival's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, before he forced a stiff smile. Of course, I understand the need for caution completely. He withdrew the flask, tucking it back beneath his cloak with movements that betrayed his growing unease. I will simply deliver it to the king directly for his approval then. As Percival turned to leave, Gareth's sharp eyes caught a small droplet that had escaped the flask's lid, landing on the stone floor near the cell bars. Instead of the pale golden color typical of medicinal tonics, the droplet carried a faint greenish tint that Gareth immediately recognized from his years of military training. Councilman, Gareth said sharply, stepping forward to block Percival's path. That is not a recovery tonic. Percival's expression twisted with sudden panic, as Gareth's hand moved instinctively toward the sword at his side. I do not know what you are implying. I have seen enough poisoned blades in my years of service to recognize the color of nightbane extract when it touches stone, Gareth said, his voice low and dangerous. You will surrender that flask immediately, or I will summon additional guards to remove it from you by force. Elena watched the confrontation unfold from within her cell, her heart pounding, as the reality of how close she had come to danger settled over her. Had Gareth not arrived when he did, she might have consumed the poisoned tonic without hesitation, trusting the false claim that it came from Cassian himself. Percival's composure finally shattered, and he attempted to flee down the corridor, but Gareth caught him easily, wresting the flask from his grip, before summoning additional guards with a sharp call that echoed through the dungeon halls. Within the hour, Cassian arrived at the dungeon, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. Percival stood restrained between two guards, his earlier composure completely dissolved into desperate justification as he attempted to explain his actions. You attempted to poison the prisoner, Cassian said, his voice dangerously quiet as he studied the flask Gareth had confiscated. A member of my own elder council, attempting murder within the walls of my castle. Your Majesty, I can explain, Percival began, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his fading confidence. Explain quickly then, Cassian said, before my patience runs out entirely. Percival's shoulders sagged as he realized the futility of further denial. Callum Ashgrove has paid me for years to ensure certain matters within his territory received favorable treatment before the council. If Elena testifies and Callum falls, I feared he would expose my involvement to save himself from further punishment. Cassian's expression grew colder with each word Percival spoke. So you decided murdering an innocent woman would be preferable to facing the consequences of your own corruption. I was desperate, Your Majesty, Percival said weakly. I never intended for things to escalate this far. You will be held for formal judgment before the full council, Cassian said, his voice leaving no room for argument. And your testimony regarding Callum's payments will be recorded as part of the evidence against him. As the guards led Percival away, Cassian turned to Elena, who remained standing near the bars of her cell, her expression a mixture of shock and lingering fear at how close she had come to danger. Are you unharmed? Cassian asked, his voice softening considerably as he studied her carefully for any sign of injury. I am unharmed, Elena said quietly, thanks to Gareth's quick thinking. Had he not arrived when he did, I would have trusted that tonic without question, believing it truly came from you. Cassian's expression darkened further at the thought of how close she had come to danger while under his protection. I should have anticipated that Callum's allies within the council might attempt something like this. I will ensure additional guards are stationed here immediately, and no visitor will be permitted access to your cell without my direct authorization. Thank you, Elena said, though her voice carried a weariness that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. It seems the truth I uncovered has made me more dangerous to certain people than I ever realized. The truth often does, Cassian said grimly, which is precisely why we must ensure it reaches the Elder Council swiftly, before Callum finds another way to silence you permanently. Elena nodded slowly, though the fear in her eyes had not entirely faded. Cassian remained by her cell long after the guards had departed, quietly resolving that he would personally oversee her safety from this point forward, unwilling to risk another attempt on her life while the truth still hung in delicate balance. The formal hearing before the Elder Council was scheduled for the following week, and Cassian used every remaining day to strengthen the case against both Callum Ashgrove and Percival Vane. Percival's confession, combined with the physical evidence of the poison tonic, provided undeniable proof of his corruption. But Cassian understood that Callum himself would not surrender so easily, and he expected the Alpha to fight fiercely against any accusation threatening his authority. Gareth had increased security around Elena's cell significantly since the poisoning attempt, rotating trusted guards on strict schedules and ensuring no visitor gained access without Cassian's direct approval. Elena, though shaken by how close she had come to death a second time, found herself growing steadily more resolved, rather than more fearful, as the hearing date approached. "I want to testify myself," Elena said one evening, as Cassian sat beside her cell, reviewing the final preparations for the hearing. "I know it carries risk, but I refuse to let others speak for me while I remain silent, hidden away in this cell like something to be protected rather than heard." Cassian studied her carefully, understanding the fierce determination behind her request, even as concern for her safety warred within him. "The council may attempt to discredit your testimony, given your status as a convicted rogue. Let them try," Elena said, her chin lifting with the same defiance he had witnessed on the execution platform days earlier. "I have hidden and run for weeks, allowing others to control the narrative of my own life. I will not hide any longer, not when the truth finally has a chance to be heard." "Then you will testify," Cassian said, respect evident in his voice, "and I will ensure the council understands the full weight of what you endured before reaching this point." The morning of the hearing arrived with a tension that seemed to hang over the entire castle. The Elder Council chamber, usually reserved for quiet deliberations among aging wolves, filled with an unusual crowd of witnesses, guards, and curious nobles eager to see how the unprecedented situation would unfold. Callum Ashgrove arrived flanked by 2 personal guards, his expression carrying the confident arrogance of a man who had spent years believing his authority, as Alpha placed him beyond serious challenge. He offered a stiff bow to Cassian before taking his designated seat, though his eyes flickered briefly toward Elena with a coldness that made her spine straighten involuntarily. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, opening the proceedings with careful formality, "we are gathered to address serious accusations against Alpha Callum Ashgrove, as well as the matter of Elena Voss's original conviction. Given the gravity of these claims, I ask that all evidence be presented clearly and without exaggeration." Cassian rose to address the council directly, presenting first the financial records uncovered during his investigation, detailing the discrepancies between reported and actual resource distribution within Ashgrove territory. Nora Whitfield followed, her testimony steady despite obvious nervousness, confirming the missing medicine supplies and Elena's original discovery of the theft. Callum's composure remained largely unshaken through the initial testimony, his expression carrying the practiced calm of a man confident in his ability to dismiss accusations through sheer force of authority. But as Owen Blackwell rose to testify about witnessing the confrontation between Elena and Callum in the Alpha's private study, a flicker of genuine concern finally crossed Callum's face. "These are the words of a former guard with grievances against my leadership," Callum said, rising to address the council directly once Owen finished speaking. "Surely the council recognizes that disgruntled subordinates often exaggerate or fabricate stories to damage the reputation of their former Alpha. And the financial records?" Cassian asked pointedly. "Do you claim those are fabricated as well?" "Record-keeping errors happen in any territory managing resources for hundreds of families," Callum said smoothly. "I cannot account for every minor discrepancy that occurs across 2 years of distribution." "A 30% discrepancy in grain reporting is hardly minor," Cassian said. "Nor is a quarter of recorded medicine supplies simply vanishing without explanation." Before Callum could respond further, Percival Vane was brought before the council, his earlier defiance completely dissolved into desperate cooperation, in hopes of leniency for his own crimes. His testimony detailing years of payments received from Callum in exchange for favorable treatment before the council sent a wave of shocked murmurs rippling through the chamber. Callum's confident mask finally began to crack as Percival continued speaking, detailing specific instances where Callum had requested his influence in council matters, along with the exact amounts of gold exchanged for these favors. "This is absurd," Callum said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Vane is simply attempting to shift blame onto me, to escape punishment for his own crimes, including the attempted poisoning of the prisoner." "The poisoning was your idea," Percival said suddenly, turning toward Callum with an expression of desperate betrayal. "You told me Elena needed to be silenced before she could testify against you. I only agreed because I feared what exposure would cost me." The chamber erupted into stunned murmurs at this direct accusation, and even Aldrich's usually composed expression shifted with visible shock. Callum's face contorted with fury as he realized the extent of Percival's willingness to expose him in exchange for leniency. "Enough," Cassian said, his voice cutting through the chaos with commanding authority. "The council has heard sufficient testimony to render judgment on these matters." Aldrich rose slowly, exchanging glances with the other council members seated around him, before addressing the chamber directly. "Given the evidence presented, including financial records, witness testimony, and the confession regarding an attempted poisoning, ordered specifically to prevent Elena Voss from testifying, this council finds that Alpha Callum Ashgrove orchestrated a false accusation of theft against Elena Voss to conceal his own corruption and theft from PAC resources." A wave of relief washed through Elena as she heard the words spoken aloud, though she remained still, unwilling to let her composure break before the entire assembled council. "The original conviction against Elena Voss is hereby overturned," Aldrich continued. "Her status as rogue is revoked, and she is declared innocent of all charges previously brought against her." The chamber filled with murmurs of reaction, some sympathetic, others still processing the shocking revelation of corruption within their own ranks. Callum, realizing the full weight of the judgment against him, attempted one final desperate protest. "Your Majesty, surely there is room for leniency," Callum said, his earlier arrogance replaced entirely by frantic pleading. "I have served as Alpha for over a decade. Surely my service counts for something against these accusations." "Your service does not excuse theft from your own vulnerable PAC members, nor does it excuse orchestrating a false conviction against an innocent woman, nor does it excuse ordering her murder to protect your own secrets," Cassian said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "You will be stripped of your title as Alpha, and formal charges will be pursued according to the laws governing theft and attempted murder within this kingdom." As guards moved forward to escort both Callum and Percival from the chamber, Elena finally allowed herself to release the breath she had been holding since the hearing began. She turned toward Cassian, finding him already watching her, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and something warmer that made her heart skip slightly, despite the exhaustion of the proceedings. "It is over," Cassian said quietly, moving to stand beside her as the chamber slowly began to empty. "It is over," Elena repeated, still struggling to fully absorb the reality of her exoneration after weeks of running and hiding from a fate she had believed inescapable. "You are free, Elena," Cassian said. "Free to choose whatever path you wish, without the shadow of false conviction hanging over you any longer." Elena studied him carefully, understanding the deeper implication behind his words. The quiet acknowledgement that her freedom now included the choice of whether to explore the bond that had brought them together under such extraordinary circumstances. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, and for fighting for the truth even when it would have been far easier to simply carry out the original sentence." "I could not have lived with myself otherwise," Cassian said. "Not once I understood what nearly happened, and not once I understood what you meant to me." As they stood together in the slowly emptying council chamber, Elena felt, for the first time since her exile began, a genuine sense of possibility stretching out before her, uncertain, but no longer defined entirely by fear. The days following the hearing brought changes to Elena's life that she was still struggling to fully comprehend. She had spent weeks as a hunted fugitive, then days as a condemned prisoner, and now she found herself settled into a modest guest chamber within Crimson Moon Castle, her innocence formally recognized before the entire Elder Council. The chamber Cassian had arranged for her sat within the eastern wing of the castle, far removed from the dungeons where she had spent her first days as prisoner. Sunlight poured through tall windows overlooking the castle gardens, a stark contrast to the small barred window of her former cell. Elena found herself standing before those windows often during her first week of freedom, watching the gardens below with an unfamiliar sense of peace that still felt fragile, as though it might shatter at any moment. Gareth had assigned 2 guards to watch over the eastern wing discreetly, a precaution Cassian insisted upon despite Callum's formal removal from power. Ashgrove territory remained without a confirmed new alpha, and rumors suggested several of Callum's former loyalists resented the exposure of his corruption, viewing Elena as the catalyst for their former leader's downfall, rather than the victim of his crimes. "You seem troubled," Cassian observed one afternoon, finding Elena seated in the castle library, a book open before her, though her attention remained fixed on the window rather than the pages. Elena looked up, offering a small, tired smile. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong. Weeks of running taught me that peace rarely lasts long before danger finds a way back into my life." Cassian settled into the chair across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that fear, more than you might realize. Ruling a kingdom teaches similar lessons, though perhaps from a different angle. Peace within these walls is often simply the quiet before the next crisis demands attention." "Is that meant to comfort me?" Elena asked, a hint of dry humor returning to her voice for the first time in days. "Perhaps not," Cassian admitted, a small smile tugging at his own mouth. "I simply meant to say that vigilance does not have to mean constant fear. You may watch for danger without allowing it to consume every moment of peace you have finally earned." Elena considered his words carefully, appreciating the honesty behind them more than empty reassurances would have offered. It is difficult advice to follow, though I understand the wisdom in it. Their conversation was interrupted by Gareth entering the library with a troubled expression, a folded letter clutched in his hand. "My king, this arrived from Ashgrove territory this morning. It appears several of Callum's former loyalists have gathered support among wolves, resentful of his removal." Cassian took the letter, scanning its contents quickly, his expression darkening as he read. "They claim Elena orchestrated false accusations against Callum out of personal vengeance, seeking to undermine his leadership for her own gain." "That is absurd," Elena said, rising from her seat with obvious frustration. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimony, his own accomplice's confession. "I know," Cassian said, folding the letter carefully. "But desperate loyalists often cling to whatever narrative allows them to avoid confronting an uncomfortable truth about their former leader. This letter suggests they intend to gather further support, potentially challenging the council's ruling." "What does this mean for Elena's safety?" Gareth asked. Cassian's jaw tightened as he considered the implications. "It means we cannot afford to become complacent, regardless of how thoroughly justice was served during the hearing. I will send additional soldiers to monitor Ashgrove territory, ensuring these loyalists understand that further attempts at retaliation will not be tolerated." Elena listened to the exchange with a growing sense of frustration. The peace she had barely begun to feel already threatened by lingering dangers she had hoped were finally behind her. "I am tired of being a target simply for telling the truth," she said quietly. Cassian moved closer, his expression softening as he studied her weary frustration. "You will not face this alone, Elena. Whatever threats remain, I intend to ensure you are protected until every remnant of Callum's corruption has been fully addressed." "And what happens after that?" Elena asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Once the immediate danger passes, what becomes of me? I am no longer a rogue, but I am also no longer bound to any pack. Where does that leave someone in my position?" Cassian hesitated, clearly considering his response carefully. "That decision belongs entirely to you, Elena. You are free to establish yourself wherever you choose, to join whatever pack might welcome you, or to remain here within Crimson Moon territory if you wish." "And the mate bond?" Elena asked, her voice quieter now, carrying a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "Does that factor into my choices, or is it simply something we both must learn to ignore, given the complications it presents?" Cassian was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing how honestly to answer such a delicate question. "I will not pretend the bond does not exist, nor will I pretend that ignoring it holds any real appeal for me. But I also understand that you have spent weeks fighting simply to reclaim your freedom and your innocence. I do not wish to pressure you into any decision regarding the bond, until you feel fully ready to consider it, free from the shadow of danger or obligation. Elena studied him carefully, appreciating the restraint he showed despite what she now understood to be his own growing feelings toward her. "That is a fair answer," she said softly. "Though I confess, I do not fully know what I want yet, beyond simply feeling safe for the first time in longer than I care to admit." "Then we will focus on ensuring that safety first," Cassian said. "Everything else can wait until you feel ready to consider it." Over the following days, Cassian dispatched additional soldiers to Ashgrove territory, working alongside Gareth to identify and address the remaining loyalists attempting to stir unrest. Several were brought before local authorities for spreading false accusations against Elena, their claims thoroughly dismantled by the same evidence already presented during the formal hearing. Slowly, the immediate threat began to fade, though Cassian remained cautious, unwilling to underestimate how deeply Callum's corruption had rooted itself within certain corners of his former territory. Elena, meanwhile, began venturing beyond her guest chamber more frequently, exploring the castle grounds and gradually interacting with members of Cassian's court, who had grown curious about the woman whose case had upended so much of their usual proceedings. Some regarded her with lingering suspicion, unable to fully separate her from the scandal surrounding her original conviction. Others, having heard the full details of Callum's corruption, treated her with quiet respect for the courage she had shown in surviving such an ordeal. Among those who grew genuinely fond of Elena during this period was a young healer named Clara Ainsworth, who had taken over supervising Elena's continued recovery from the physical toll of her weeks as a fugitive. Clara's warmth and easy conversation provided Elena with her first genuine friendship since fleeing Ashgrove territory. A small but meaningful comfort as she adjusted to her new circumstances. "You seem different than the rumors suggested," Clara observed one afternoon, as she checked the fading scars along Elena's wrists from her time in chains. "Half the castle expected a hardened criminal. Instead, I find someone simply trying to rebuild a life stolen from her unjustly." "I am learning that rumors rarely capture the full truth of anything," Elena replied, a small genuine smile crossing her face. As weeks passed, and the immediate dangers from Ashgrove territory continued to fade, Elena found herself settling more comfortably into her new life within Crimson Moon Castle, though the question of what her future truly held, and what role the mate bond with Cassian might eventually play within it, remained a question she continued turning over carefully in her mind. Autumn settled over Vermont with a chill that swept through the castle gardens, turning the leaves along the eastern wing to shades of gold and deep red. Elena had grown accustomed to walking those gardens each morning, a habit that had become one of the few reliable comforts in a life still finding its footing after months of upheaval. It was during one such morning walk that she encountered Cassian, dressed simply rather than in his usual formal attire, seated on a stone bench near the garden's central fountain. He looked up as she approached, offering a warm smile that had grown more natural between them over the weeks since the hearing. "You are awake early," Elena observed, settling onto the bench beside him, close enough to feel the familiar warmth that always seemed to radiate from him whenever they were near one another. "I often find it difficult to sleep past dawn," Cassian admitted. "Old habits from years of early training, I suppose." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning mist slowly burn away beneath the rising sun. Elena had noticed, over recent weeks, how these quiet moments between them had grown easier, the initial wariness she carried toward him slowly softening into something closer to genuine comfort. "Ashgrove territory has stabilized considerably," Cassian said eventually, breaking the silence. "The council has approved a new alpha to oversee the pack, a wolf named Simon Hargrove, who served faithfully under Callum's rule, while quietly documenting much of the corruption himself. He has already begun redistributing resources properly among the families who were previously neglected." "That is good news," Elena said, relief evident in her voice. "I worried for those families, wondering if justice for me would translate into any real improvement for their situation." "Simon has expressed gratitude for your courage in exposing Callum's crimes," Cassian added. "He mentioned that several families have already benefited from the corrected distribution of grain and medicine." Elena felt a swell of quiet satisfaction at this news, understanding that her ordeal had ultimately produced something meaningful beyond simply securing her own freedom. "I am glad something good came from all of this, beyond simply my own survival." Cassian studied her for a long moment, something contemplative crossing his expression. "May I ask you something personal, Elena?" Of course, she said, curiosity evident in her tone. Have you given any further thought to what you wish to do now, with your freedom fully restored? Cassian asked carefully. You have remained within the castle for several weeks now, though I have never wished for you to feel obligated to stay simply out of gratitude or uncertainty about other options. Elena considered the question seriously, appreciating that he had waited this long before raising it directly. I have thought about it often, she admitted. For a long time, my entire identity was built around service to Ashgrove, and then around simply surviving as a fugitive. I am not entirely certain who I am, separate from those circumstances. That seems like a reasonable uncertainty, given everything you have endured, Cassian said gently. But I have also thought about the bond between us, Elena continued, her voice growing quieter, more vulnerable. I cannot pretend I do not feel it, Cassian. Even now, sitting here beside you, I feel a pull that has nothing to do with gratitude or circumstance. It exists independently of everything else that happened between us. Cassian's expression shifted, hope flickering behind his careful composure. I feel it as well, he said softly. Every day since that moment on the platform, I have felt it growing stronger, though I have tried to respect the space you needed to heal from everything that happened before we ever properly knew one another. I know, Elena said, and I am grateful for that patience, more than I have properly expressed until now. It would have been easy for you to press the matter sooner, given your position and the undeniable nature of the bond. Instead, you allowed me the space to rebuild my sense of self, before asking me to consider anything more. I did not wish for our bond to feel like another obligation forced upon you, Cassian said. Not after everything Callum's corruption already stole from your ability to choose your own path freely. Elena reached out, her hand finding his where it rested on the stone bench between them, the contact sending a familiar warmth through her that she no longer felt inclined to resist or deny. I still do not know everything about who I want to become, separate from everything that has happened, she said. But I know that whatever path I choose, I want you to be part of it, Cassian. Not because fate demanded it through some bond neither of us fully chose, but because I have watched you fight for truth and justice, even when doing so cost you politically and personally. That is not something the bond created. That is simply who you are, and it is something I have come to genuinely admire, separate from anything fate decided for us. Cassian's fingers tightened gently around hers, emotion evident in his expression as he absorbed her words. Elena, I do not wish to rush you into anything before you feel entirely certain, but hearing you say this means more to me than I can properly express. I am not rushing, Elena said, a small smile crossing her face. I have simply had enough time now to understand my own feelings clearly, separate from fear or uncertainty about my circumstances. I want to explore what exists between us, Cassian, properly and without the shadow of danger or obligation hanging over the decision. For a long moment, they simply sat together in the quiet morning garden, hands clasped between them, the weight of everything they had endured together, finally beginning to settle into something resembling genuine peace. There is something else I wish to discuss, Cassian said eventually, his tone growing slightly more formal despite the warmth still evident in his eyes. The council has continued to press me regarding matters of succession and stability within the kingdom. Given the unusual circumstances surrounding your case, and the growing awareness throughout the kingdom of the bond between us, they have begun asking pointed questions about your intentions. What sort of questions? Elena asked, though she suspected she already understood the direction of his thoughts. Whether you intend to remain within Crimson Moon territory permanently, Cassian said, and whether, given time, you might consider accepting a more formal role within the kingdom, beyond simply residing here as a guest. Elena's heart quickened slightly at the implication behind his careful phrasing, though she recognized this conversation as merely a step toward a larger decision, rather than the decision itself. Are you asking whether I intend to become your mate in truth, not merely in the recognition our wolves already share? I suppose I am, Cassian admitted, a slight flush coloring his usually composed expression, though I do not wish to press you toward an answer before you feel entirely ready to give one. I believe I am beginning to feel ready, Elena said softly, though I would ask for a little more time to be certain, given everything that has happened between us in such a short span. Take whatever time you need, Cassian said. I have waited this long already, and I find that waiting a little longer, now that I understand your feelings mirror my own, feels considerably easier to bear. Elena smiled, leaning slightly closer to him as the morning sun continued rising over the castle gardens, casting warm light across the fading autumn leaves scattered around them. Whatever uncertainty remained about the exact shape her future would take, she found herself increasingly confident that whatever came next, she no longer faced it alone, nor did she face it burdened by fear of the powerful men who had once sought to control or silence her. For the first time since fleeing Ashgrove territory months earlier, Elena felt genuinely hopeful about what lay ahead, not because fate had decided her path for her, but because she had finally reclaimed the freedom to choose it herself. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the towers of Crimson Moon Castle with the season's first snow, just as preparations began for an announcement that had already spread through Vermont, despite the court's attempts to keep the details private until Cassian was ready to share them formally. Elena stood before the tall mirror in her chamber, now considerably more than a simple guest room, having been gradually filled over recent weeks with belongings and touches that reflected her own tastes, rather than the sparse furnishings she had first arrived to months earlier. Clara Ainsworth fussed gently with the fastenings of Elena's gown, a deep green fabric that complemented the auburn tones of her hair, now grown long and healthy after months free from the deprivation of her time as a fugitive. "You seem nervous," Clara observed, tucking a final pin into place. "I am announcing my acceptance of a bond before the entire Elder Council and half the kingdom's nobility," Elena said, a wry smile crossing her face, despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "I believe nervousness is a reasonable response." Clara laughed softly, stepping back to admire her work. "You have faced far more dangerous things than a room full of curious nobles, Elena. I believe you will manage perfectly well." Elena appreciated the reassurance, though the significance of what awaited her downstairs remained heavy in her mind. Months had passed since the morning in the garden when she had first admitted her feelings to Cassian. Months spent slowly building trust and understanding between them, separate from the urgency of danger or political necessity that had defined their earliest interactions. During that time, Elena had watched Cassian work tirelessly, not only to stabilize Ashgrove territory under its new leadership, but to review similar concerns across other pacts within his kingdom, uncovering and correcting several smaller instances of corruption that had gone unnoticed for years under previous rulers less willing to question established authority. His commitment to justice, evident from the very moment he had chosen to investigate her claims, rather than simply carrying out her execution, had only deepened Elena's respect and affection for him, as she came to understand the full scope of his character. The Elder Council, initially resistant to any suggestion of formal ceremony surrounding Elena's acceptance of the bond, had gradually softened their position as they witnessed her genuine dedication to the well-being of the kingdom, including her involvement in establishing new safeguards to ensure accusations of theft or rogue status received proper investigation before any sentencing occurred. Even Aldrich Thorne, who had initially viewed her with considerable suspicion, had come to acknowledge her contribution to strengthening the very system that had once nearly condemned her unjustly. A soft knock sounded at her chamber door, and Elena turned to find Gareth waiting outside, dressed in formal attire befitting the occasion rather than his usual guard uniform. "The king asked me to escort you down, if you are ready," Gareth said, offering a respectful bow. "I am ready," Elena said, drawing a steadying breath before following him from the chamber. The great hall of Crimson Moon Castle had been transformed for the occasion, banners bearing the crest of the kingdom hanging alongside simple winter greenery that lent the space a warmth despite the cold season outside. Nobles and common folk alike filled the hall, their earlier skepticism about the unusual circumstances surrounding Elena's story replaced largely by genuine curiosity and, in many cases, quiet admiration for a woman who had survived such an extraordinary ordeal, only to emerge stronger and more determined to see justice properly served. Cassian stood at the head of the hall, dressed in formal royal attire, his expression carrying a warmth that had grown steadily more visible in the months since the hearing that had finally cleared Elena's name. As she entered the hall and made her way toward him, their eyes met across the crowded space, and the familiar pull of the bond settled comfortably between them, no longer a source of confusion or uncertainty, but a steady reassurance of the choice they had both made freely. "Elena Voss," Cassian said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall as she reached the platform where he stood. "Months ago, Fate placed you before me, under circumstances neither of us could have anticipated. I nearly failed you completely, blinded by tradition and duty, to a law that had been corrupted by those seeking to protect their own crimes. Yet even in that moment, my wolf recognized something in you that I could not ignore, and I am endlessly grateful that recognition arrived in time to prevent a tragedy that would have haunted me for the rest of my life. Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as he spoke, the weight of everything they had endured together, finally settling into this moment of quiet triumph. Since that day, Cassian continued, I have watched you rebuild your life with a strength and grace that has only deepened my admiration for you. You have faced danger, betrayal, and uncertainty, with courage I have rarely witnessed in anyone, regardless of rank or station. I do not simply accept the bond fate has placed between us, Elena. I choose you, freely and completely, as my equal, my partner, and my mate. Elena stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the emotion evident in her expression. Cassian Ashworth, when you raised that sword above me months ago, I believed my life had reached its end. Instead, you gave me something I never expected to find again, after everything Callum stole from me. You gave me the chance to reclaim my truth, and in doing so, you taught me that justice still exists within this kingdom, even when powerful men attempt to corrupt it for their own gain. She reached out, taking his hands in hers before continuing. I accept this bond not simply because fate decided it for us, but because I have watched you fight for what is right, even when doing so cost you politically and personally. I choose you as well, Cassian, freely and completely, as my mate, my partner, and my king. The hall erupted into applause and cheers as Cassian drew her into an embrace, the formal ceremony marking not only the acceptance of their mate bond, but the beginning of Elena's new role within the kingdom as Luna Queen, a title that carried with it both the honor of her position beside Cassian and the responsibility of continuing the work they had begun together in ensuring justice reached even the most vulnerable members of their kingdom. In the weeks that followed, Elena worked alongside Cassian and the Elder Council to establish new protocols requiring thorough investigation before any accusation of rogue status could result in execution. Protocols that included mandatory review by an independent panel, rather than relying solely on an alpha's word. The reforms, while initially met with resistance from a few traditionalists within the council, gradually gained widespread support, as word spread of how close the kingdom had come to executing an innocent woman, based on nothing more than a corrupt alpha's fabricated accusation. Simon Hargrove, now firmly established as the new alpha of Ashgrove territory, sent word regularly of the pack's recovery, describing improved conditions for families who had suffered under Callum's corruption, and expressing continued gratitude toward Elena for her courage in exposing the truth, regardless of the personal cost it had nearly demanded of her. Callum himself remained imprisoned, stripped permanently of his title and standing, while Percival Vane faced similar consequences for his role in the corruption and the attempted poisoning that had nearly claimed Elena's life a second time. Their fall from power served as a lasting reminder throughout the kingdom that authority, no matter how firmly established, remained accountable to the truth when enough courage existed to pursue it. As winter deepened around Crimson Moon Castle, Elena found herself standing once more before the tall windows of her chamber, though the space now felt entirely her own, rather than simply a temporary refuge granted by circumstance. Cassian joined her quietly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched snow settle gently over the gardens below. "Do you have any regrets?" Cassian asked softly, echoing perhaps his own quiet uncertainty about how she truly felt regarding everything that had unfolded since that fateful day on the execution platform. Elena considered the question seriously before answering, her mind drifting back through the weeks of fear, the moments of betrayal, and the slow rebuilding of trust that had ultimately led them to this point together. "No regrets," she said finally, leaning into his embrace with quiet contentment. "Only gratitude, that fate chose to intervene when it did, and that you were willing to listen to what your instincts told you, even when doing so meant defying tradition and risking everything you had built as king." "I would defy far more than tradition for you, Elena," Cassian said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss against her hair. "I dropped my sword the moment I recognized you as my mate, and I have never once regretted that choice, regardless of what it cost me politically in the months that followed." Elena smiled, turning to face him fully as the snow continued falling silently outside their window. Then let us ensure that choice was worth every difficulty we faced along the way, by building a kingdom where truth and justice remain protected, regardless of the power or position held by those who might seek to corrupt it. Together, Cassian said, his expression carrying the same quiet resolve that had first led him to question an execution order months earlier, a resolve that had ultimately transformed not only Elena's fate, but the very foundation of justice within his kingdom. Together, Elena agreed, and as they stood watching the winter snow blanket the castle grounds below, both understood that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as true equals, bound not merely by fate, but by a shared commitment to the justice and courage that had brought them together in the first place.